Welcome to MedHeads, the weekly show that brings a biopsychosocial focus to issues of the day, along with special guests who will showcase their expertise and enthusiasm about their field of practice. Your host, Dr. Fergal Armstrong.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong and welcome to MedHeads. Today we're chatting with Maree Eisma, one of our regular guests, and we will be discussing trauma-focused therapies. Maree, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
Good. So we've previously discussed trauma, and I suppose today is an opportunity to chat about trauma therapies. So can you give us some examples of what you would see as appropriate therapies to help people who have been the victims of trauma?
Yeah, so I mentioned last time the psychoeducation is really important. The other thing that I often talk about are the grounding techniques. When people are in full flights of their activation of their flight-freeze response, the common reactions are wanting to get away from that feeling of feeling really distressed, heightened arousal, heart racing, all of those anxiety type symptoms. And so some of the biggest things I get people to do is be able to regulate their physiology. So basically doing everything we can to engage from or disengage from those often, majorly fearful thoughts that are going on when someone's in the throes of like a PTSD reaction. It's all happening again. I'm never going to be able to get to this nightmare. And this repetitiousness of that whole process. So that bringing the techniques of grounding, such as bringing people into what can they see, smell, hear, feel, and taste, brings people back into what's happening in the present, and also engages different parts of the brain, so that they can start to feel like they're getting a little bit more control over symptoms. The other thing that I notice too with clients is when they're feeling very like if they're out of their body. Some of the work from Peter Levine talks about even just sort of tapping to get a sense of bringing themselves back into their bodies. And then there's a whole range of other techniques such as emotional freedom technique and EMDR, which are two other techniques I work with. Right. But essentially it's that bringing that grounding technique is the first thing I teach.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So firstly, you mentioned the idea that grounding is used to bring people back to the here and now, and it's used to control their physiology. So can you describe to us what abnormal physiology means and why does it occur in the context of trauma?
So with trauma, someone actually feels like the symptoms, like a lot of the times people will be avoiding situations of anything that reminds them of the trauma or the unpleasant sensation or sensations they might have experienced. So you can understand that if people start to want to avoid that, going back out and trying to live a normal life as a human can feel really, incredibly threatening. So if you imagine for someone who's experienced trauma, imagine a tiger is chasing, you. You're going to have all of those the symptoms and the sensations, heart racing, not being able to focus, not being able to take on any new information, the sweaty, a lot of those anxiety, almost panic type symptoms are what people with PTSD or, who have experienced trauma continually have activated in their bodies. So one of the things that we try to do is get away from that.
Isn't that the flight or fight? Yeah. So basically, am I hearing this right? You're basically alluding to the signs and symptoms of a panic attack. Is that right? Yeah,
for a lot of people, or if they're not actually having them, they're always so fearful of having those experiences. Yeah. So they've often got quite intense levels of anxiety. So whenever we work on trying to, what I call, and I'm taking the work from Kelly Brogan, send a signal of safety to the brain, we're trying to let the brain know that we're actually okay and work with different parts of the brain that get online to reinstill a sense I'm actually okay, I'm not in the trauma, I'm actually here and now, which is exactly what you said before.
Right, so grounding is a way of reducing the physiological signs and symptoms of anxiety which occur as a result of trauma. Am I hearing that right? Is that what you're trying to say? So in that case then, give me some examples more specifically of grounding techniques.
Yeah. So I mentioned before, one of the things I get from Peter Levine is around the tapping and just making sure that you're in your body. So essentially we can do things like, a client might be really starting to, oh my gosh, it's all happening again. I can feel it all going on. So what I will actually get them to do is, okay, tell me what, if you look around, what are you seeing? Okay, I'm seeing a wall, I'm seeing the floor, I'm seeing a pot plant. I might get them to, to identify 5 things that they can see in around their area. Again, that means that they're having to use different parts of the brain, meaning they can't be ruminating, because if they're too busy then trying to focus on what's happening in the here and now, then they're using different mechanisms of the brain. So I might get them to tell me what they feel. So it could be, okay, can you feel your feet really anchored into the earth? Can you really feel your feet firmly on the floor? Again, there's that technique of bringing them back into the body. Then might be looking at things like, what can you smell? Well, if I've got an oil burning, or did you put some, fragrance on this morning? Looking at things of, but what can you taste? Oh well, yeah, okay, I've just had coffee, or no, I've just brushed my teeth. So essentially, anything that we can do to bring back those, engaging of those 5 senses are really important in first line response.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's the engagement of our 5 senses, which means that the brain cannot focus on its own internal stress. It has to focus on processing the information that it's receiving from our 5 senses. The brain can't 100%. Do 2 things at once. Is that right?
It can't do 2 things. That's right. So it can't be activated into our, oh my goodness, this is all happening all over again. I'm not going to be able to survive this. It can't get into the internal dialogue and the mutterings and the ruminations if it's now focusing on what's going on in the present. So that's
if
very
it's
very well captured.
If it's focused on the external, it can't focus on the internal dialogue.
That's right.
And that's essentially what grounding techniques are. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And the consequences of that is it brings everything back, like, the breathing will stabilize, the heart rate will start to settle, just anything that brings us back out of those horrible symptoms that a lot of people feel like they're they just cannot get away from.
Right. So if we're basically diverting mental energy away from the amygdala into various other sensory functions in the brain, that's right. I think that's what I'm trying to say to you. So grounding is one technique to deal with the physiological aspects of trauma. So and I suppose the physiological aspects of a trauma response are more so the manifestations of the psychological experience. So it's not actually treating the psychological experience, is it? Tell us a little bit about the psychological experience in trauma.
It's that fear, for a lot of people, it's distrust of other people. It's around that being, easily aroused. It's just essentially not feeling safe. Some people won't take on certain new roles. They'll stay stuck. They won't, they'll just essentially avoid. And people's careers have been compromised by the impact of things like trauma, because psychologically they are so fearful of having another series or circumstances or events play out, that they actually can completely avoid situations. And, if someone's like in answer to your question, the psychological things is, as I said, the avoidance. It's that fear of I don't have any mastery over this. I'm doomed to keep living this repetitious cycle over and over and over again, even though intellectually I realise I'm not, in combat, or I'm not in the motor vehicle accident, or I'm not being sexually assaulted. The body tells a different story, and it's this constant battle between this is what the emotions are telling me, and intellectually this is what I'm trying to tell myself. So, yeah.
And the emotions win over the intellect every time.
Absolutely, it does all the time, and that's what makes it so damn frustrating for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think of our central nervous system very basically on 3 levels. I think of it as the lizard brain, and then on top of that we have the mammalian brain, and then on top of that we have the human brain. And the lizard brain I regard as kind of, the basic biological functions in the medulla and the ponds, you know, your breathing, respiration, etc., etc. The lizard, so that's the lizard brain. Then I think of the mammalian brain, which is basically the limbic system, the emotional regulation or dysregulation part of the brain, and then the human brain being the cortices and how we think. And, you know, the mammalian brain overrides the human brain all the time. You know, the emotional response to events can overwhelm us if it's not dealt with. It's more powerful.
And exactly what you speak about is exactly what I go through with clients, because when we understand the different functions of each of those parts, you know, we can actually start to help people, you know, understand that their body in the most bizarrest of ways is actually operating effectively. It's just being triggered inappropriately a lot of the time. And
Yeah.
but again, if we don't understand, we just feel like our body's just are turning on us and is, you know, almost setting us up for failure. And until we actually understand the relationship of those three different parts of the brain, it makes it a lot of sense. And you can see the relief when people go, oh, that's what's happening. But you are right. The emotional part of it will you know, that will constantly keep hiccuping before we can work with the, you know, the other parts.
Right. So I suppose psychology is actually, I suppose I actually have to modify what I've just said, because psychology is, I think, a way of teaching the human brain, the cortices, methods to actually distract from an overfiring mammalian brain. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually you can tame your mammalian brain with the appropriate psychological techniques. So we've discussed grounding. We've discussed how psychology overwhelms our emotional brain, our mammalian brain, to cause all of these physiological phenomena and to cause us to feel in that fright or flight or freeze mode. What other therapies are out there that you can tell us about that help with trauma? You've mentioned two in particular. You've mentioned EMDR, an emotional freedom technique. So let's talk about EMDR first of all.
Yeah, so EMDR, as I understand, has been recognised by the World Health Organization as one of the first-line interventions for trauma. And essentially it's come from a work of eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. So it came from the work of Shapira. I know. So if I break it down, essentially the way that it was explained and it was trained to me is that our memory networks, if you think about sort of a circle and it's divided into three parts, when somebody experiences a trauma, the memory networks store it in either, you know, in a couple of different ways. But one is sort of the sensory, auditory, visual, kinesthetic component. So that kind of sits in 1/3 of that circle. Then the other part of the memory or the trauma is stored in the meaning, the personal meaning that we attach to it. So it could be things like, I'm out of control, I've got no choice, I'm vulnerable, I should have done something different. And then in the other third is the somatic experiences, so the somatic or the emotional responses. And so if you think about that sort of circle, so this is what they refer to as like the adapted memory or the adapted learning, information learning process. So basically it sits like this. And what happens is when we've got a trauma response, or when we've got a trauma that's kind of stored that way, any one of those three networks can sort of link us straight back to experiencing a trauma all over again. So if you think about somebody who has a meaning, if their personal meaning during the attack or an assault or a trauma was, I don't feel safe, I'm vulnerable. That, so if a manager says to an employee, right, I need to see you at 3:00 today, can you please come in? Even though that has nothing to do with the trauma they may have experienced a while ago, if it interferes with that or starts to resonate on that same connection, it's possible that it will stir up an anxiety or a trauma reaction again. Does that kind of make sense? Or if somebody starts all of a sudden getting their heart rate up because they're at the gym, but their body, they start to make the linkage back. Oh my gosh, that's what happened when I was chased by, you know, a gang of youths who wanted to, you know, steal me from my Reeboks. Then you've got that same reaction going on. So again, it's completely separate to the original experience, but the brain goes, oh, that feels familiar. And then it stirs up a whole process all over again.
Yeah. So tell us about the somatic, because you told us about the kinesthetic, the meaning, and then finally give me an example of how the somatic triggers function.
Yeah, so the somatic is essentially what's happening in the body. So it's that knot in the stomach, it's that feeling, that sinking feeling. It could be that heaviness. It could be like, I feel so light, I don't even feel in my body. So they're the different networks that we're trying to kind of connect with. So that's the adapted information processing. All
right. And what about the kinesthetic then?
So the kinesthetic is essentially the way it's kind of, the kinesthetic is sort of what you're sensing, what you're doing. It's more around those sorts of things.
So would that, I mean, if we're talking about the analogy of running away from someone who's about to mug you for your Reeboks, the kinesthetic would be the feeling of running on the ground fast, you know, how your feet felt in the shoes, that kind of thing. Whereas the somatic would be your heart rate going up and your breathing going fast, and then the meaning would be I'm threatened, you know, I've got to get away from this. Is that fair enough?
That's right. Yeah, precisely.
So I suppose another way of emphasizing what kinesthetic is, you know, I suppose it's the feeling of your joints, your creaking joints. You know, if you've got arthritis, I suppose that's more somatic. You know, how do you actually know where your how do you know where your foot is in terms of your body, in terms of your knee or your ankle, or in fact, how do you know where your hand is in terms of your mouth when you're trying to feed yourself? That's kinesthetic awareness, isn't it?
Yes, how everything's connected, interconnected.
Yeah. So go on. Those are the three processes of sensation. How does that relate to trauma? Or EMDR?
So as I mentioned, any one of those networks can be a way of signifying or sending a false signal back to the body that there's a threat or there's an imminent risk or they're not safe. So, you know, when we do work with EMDR, what sort of came from, so generally if we have a trauma, we will have a set of unpleasant experiences. We may be able to talk to our friends, talk to a teacher, talk to somebody else about our experience. However, if we experience that event to be so shameful, to be so compromising to our ego, that we feel ashamed, or we feel that we've failed somebody, or any whole range of things, essentially what will happen is we may then decide not to talk about it. Or if we go to talk about it and people are so busy, we might just think, oh, look, it's okay, I'll try to. But what tends to happen with trauma is a lot of people don't want to, something that's a yucky experience, they don't even want to have to think about it. They want to ignore it. So what tends to happen, and this is, you know, the offerings from the work of Shapira, she was sort of saying that normally when we go to sleep, our brains will start to go through the REM process and the different sleep cycles, and somehow we wake up the next day and our brains have been able to kind of, you know, compartmentalize things, sort things out, digest them, put them in a way that somehow makes sense. Often what's happened with trauma is our sleep cycle ends up compromised. We may not have been able to talk about it with anyone during the day. We've then tried to go to sleep. We can't sleep. We're, you know, because of the activation of the flight response, we can't go into those sleep cycles properly, and essentially nothing gets processed. So it's sort of the way it's explained is that it sort of sits in short-term memory. So it sort of sits more at the front rather than having moved back across into longer-term memory. So therefore it sits ripe for any sort of activation of anything that connects with the original trauma, or even something that the brain makes the linkage with. So therefore we get constantly activated. So EMDR is basically a way of working through that process. And
what do you actually do? You know, what does it mean? What is eye movement desensitization? So
the work the essentially it's to do with the eye movement processing. So it's what they refer to as bilateral. So bilateral stimulation can be anything from essentially an EMDR where sitting opposite somebody and we're getting them to watch a sequence of eye and hand movements, and the person's eyes actually follow just like they would if they were actually in sleep. So what we're doing, a lot of people have, understandably avoidant of wanting to work on the trauma. They don't want to, because it's like, if you're going to make me have to relive it, I don't want to have to go through that. The natural response is to avoid that. So what we do is we do get them to talk about a certain section of the memory, but at the same time we're doing the eye movements, which what tends to happen is the arousal response comes down. And when we're doing EMDR well, so EMDR can be done, as I said, with eye movements and hand movements. It can be done through bilateral stimulation. So it could be something like butterfly tapping. With young children, I might use a wand or a magical wand. It could be even just tapping of the feet. So essentially, it's anything that gets that the bilateral brain stimulation. And what tends to happen, it's hard to sort of explain, but if somebody has if their level of what we call a SUDS, we're always gauging the SUDS score. So, the SUDS is that subjective units of distress, and we're asking a client when they first have that memory or that image comes to mind, they might say they rate it as a 9 out of 10. It's so distressing. It's so unpleasant. What we do is when we're doing the eye movements or we're doing the bilateral stimulation, we get them to sort of just go wherever they want to go, just like they would with dreams. If you think about when we're dreaming, no one's in there directing the quality of the dream. We're not getting actors on board. We're not having someone script it. We just essentially let our brains go where they need to go. So EMDR, we allow the person to go through the same process. So, I might say to them, okay, what's happening now? What are you noticing? And they might say, well, I'm noticing that the train's slowing down. And I say, okay, just so stay with that. So we just let the brain go where it wants to go. But what ends up happening, rather amazingly, is that where the distress was originally sitting at a 9 out of 10, it's now down to a 0, and there's no experience, or the body's clear. So there's a whole process that I couldn't go through in space of half an hour.
Sure.
But what happens is essentially people will go back and we'll ask them to go back to the memory, and they'll go, it's vague, or it's distant, or it's out there somewhere. It doesn't feel anywhere near as close anymore. And that's the relief that people really enjoy from EMDR.
So what I'm hearing is that bilateral stimulation or bilateral eye movement distracts the brain from the rawness of a trauma memory, allows some form of free flow thinking, which then puts that trauma memory to bed. Is that an appropriate but crude way of summarizing what EMDR does?
Yeah, it allows the brain to, so generally processing, could still be in effect 24, 48 hours after an EMDR session.
Yeah.
So you have this unbelievable ability to make it succinct, but that's exactly what it does. It allows the brain to reprocess it and move it from short-term memory to long-term memory, which would have essentially happened if the situation when the original trauma had have happened, if the same ingredients were there, it would have been able to do that.
All right. So let's move on to emotional freedom technique. What is it?
Okay, so emotional freedom technique is it's basically tapping. So if we often know that there is a thing called acupuncture. And so a really good way of understanding EFT is to liken it to emotional acupuncture. So what we tend to do is tap on certain parts of the body at the same time. So it works a bit different. With cognitive behavioral work, we work on the cognitions, and then the cognitions tend to change the behaviors. EFT tends to work on the emotional reactions, and therefore the cognitions change afterwards. It works in a completely different way. So the way EFT was explained to me was, you imagine whippersnipping down weeds, which basically just keeps the lawn tidy or the weeds at bay. But EFT actually removes the weeds. It removes the weed, the plant, essentially the weed, roots. The roots and everything. So it's a different process.
So That's a very interesting concept, comparing EFT with CBT. So in CBT, altering the cognition alters the emotional response and the behavior. But what you're saying here with EFT is that altering the emotional response alters the upstream cognition, which then means that with EFT, it's not actually necessary to rehash the trauma. I mean, that's what a lot of patients fear. Look, doc, I just don't want to go into it. It's too painful. But with EFT, the actual trauma and the actual cognitions around it and the fear, et cetera, don't matter. All you're worried about, or all you're trying to deal with at the moment there and then is the emotional response and tapping that away, basically. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's actually really, amazing because, I did 3 days worth of training and actually using a lot of EFT for emotional eating. And it's really interesting how once it's cleared from the body, it's not there. It just is not there anymore. It's quite liberating.
Right.
It's actually, the relief is massive.
So let me just, as a layman in terms of psychological therapies, let me just put this into my mind. Tapping on the body does what?
Yeah. It tends to release blockages that are in the body. Look, when I first heard about EFT probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was a little bit,
Yeah,
but there's actually got such
mumbo jumbo-ish.
It sounds very, woo-woo-ish and stuff like that. However, I actually watched, there was an interview of 4 veterans who had, everything from PTSD to major depressive disorder to substance abuse disorder to panic disorder, generalized anxiety. Wives were about to walk out the door because they couldn't cope with the emotional volatility in the house. It was like chaos. Kids couldn't talk because it'll set the father off. And it was fascinating to watch the process from these 4 guys who, couldn't even sit in the chair properly. Their symptoms were so horrendous. To interviewed a couple of days after, there's a technique that they use in EFT called tell the story. And you see them, a day or so after having experienced the EFT, and not one of them met clinical criteria for any of the symptoms that they originally had.
Right.
So there's a huge following in that. Yeah.
All right. So it's not mumbo jumbo. It does work. No. But talk me through exactly what happens. I'm still not clear. So here I am. I'm sitting in a chair. You're my therapist. What do you do? What do I do? What's going on?
Okay, so like with EMDR, we would be asking about, what's the level of distress. So we're, again, scoring the SUDS. And if someone says, and it's fascinating to use the severity so the severity units of distress.
Severity?
So,
right.
Severity units of distress. So it's basically, if I'm scoring, say, pain, it's fascinating. A lot of people are like, oh, what's she going to do? Okay, talk to me about this, EFT stuff. Yeah. And the best way that I've worked and got clients to do it is I'll ask them if they've got any pain. And they'll go, yeah, I've got a stiff neck, slept dodgy last night, or, I've got a bit of a headache, or I've got some, arthritis or some pain in my knee or my elbow, and I'll get them to rate it. And starts off as a 7, and by the time they're done, it's a 0, and they're like, what? So essentially, again, we're using the SUDS, and I will get them to tap on a karate chop point, which is essentially here, and I'll get them to tap there. And what this works on is psychological reversal. How many times have you seen people who say, yeah, no, I really, really want to give up smoking, but, and then there's a little chime at the back that's going, I don't know about giving up that. I don't know about, so it's not the right time. So the karate chop point tapping actually works on psychological reversal. And that just means that we're working on the back of the brain so it doesn't buy into those stories. But essentially we're tapping on certain points of the body and talking as we go through that.
Well, what are we talking about? Am I just tapping my karate chop point?
No, so it might say something like, so an example of that would be, even though I have this incredible pain, it's a 7 out of 10, I totally accept. Now, some people will say to me, I cannot say I totally love and accept myself because they just can't say it. So what I might say is I accept and I'm open to learning to love myself. So I'll get them to say that 3 times. Then I move them onto the different, it's connected with the meridian points, but essentially there's different parts that we tap on.
Right.
And it brings down the cortisol levels. So research has actually told us that when we use EFT, we can bring our cortisol levels down by about 35%. They had to rescore the original test because they thought there was something wrong with they actually thought there was either something wrong with the way that the testing was done, but then they repeatedly repeated the testing, and it came up to the same results.
So
eating, go.
So if I can just summarize that for the moment, right? So we're tapping on various parts of the body which are related to the meridian points, and we're using mantras such as I am open and free to love myself.
So that's in your setup statement, but the tapping would actually be something like, all of this pain, I have all of this pain. And I think what I love about EFT is you're voicing what's going on in your body anyway.
Right.
You know, you can't dance. I think the psyche is a bit too smart. It knows if you're feeling crappy. It knows if you're in pain. It knows if you're, if this is causing major disablement or causing incredible frustration, if it's becoming incredibly limiting in your life. So you're voicing all those things. There's something about it actually hitting the air when you can actually have your voice and your words hit the air saying, this is terrible. I hate this. My life, I'm suffering. Then what happens is we rescore the SUDS, and we'll say to someone, what are you noticing now? And more often than not, people will say, well, it's not a 7 or not a 9 anymore. It's down to a 3. And then what I'll do is I'll get them to say, okay, so even though I still have this pain, so we're using the word even. So we're not fooling the brain. We're going to say, hey, look, the brain still acknowledges this. We're not going to dismiss that. It still acknowledges there's some pain. We then go through another round, and what happens is it usually goes from a 3 down to a 0, and it's cleared. It doesn't come back again.
So Maree, thank you so much for your pearls of wisdom as usual. We've discussed the responses to trauma and the therapies that can be used to help with trauma. We've discussed grounding technique, EMDR and EFT. I really hope that we can talk again soon. Thank you.
No problems. Thank you.
That's all for today's show. My name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and I look forward to your joining with us again soon.